In the Name of Overhead Athletics podcast, where we cover rehabilitation, biomechanics, human movement, and optimizing human performance. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Max Wardell. Today I have a special guest, Rob Gray, from the Perception in Action podcast in Arizona State University. Rob is an author. He is a professor. He is really an innovator in the field of motor learning and ecological dynamics. We're going to get into that today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Max. My pleasure to be here.
This was a good one to set up and get into because, and I've been thinking about this for a little while. If I took your podcast, the materials that you've put out, add a couple books to that, including some of Franz Bosch's books, in my estimation, you have the equivalent of probably a master's degree if you go through all of that material on motor learning and ecological dynamics. So thank you for putting that out, but I want to dig into some wormholes and dig into some specifics here today.
For sure. That sounds great.
So talk to me a little bit just about what is ecological dynamics and how does that compare to an information processing approach? Because a lot of times the coaches out there or even the rehabilitation professionals get kind of into one lane of thinking, or they're taught a certain way in school, and that's not necessarily how the body actually works. And whether they know it or not, they're kind of put themselves into probably an information processing theory because that's the one that's kind of the foremost or the eminent one in university, especially in exercise science programs and sport performance programs and those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a great point, Max. I think it's true, and I think it's so dominant in just all over how we think about learning. I think we've kind of lost the motivation and understanding of our underlying theory sometimes. Yeah. So the ecological dynamics. So the traditional information processing idea is that we start to control our actions. We need to take information from the environment and process it in some way, add things to it, make predictions, bring in, kind of guess what might happen. Versus ecological dynamics really starts with the idea of direct perception. The idea that if you look for it, there's information out there in the environment that you can tell you what you need to know to perform any action just by linking your movement to it. And that's a kind of a term we use, perception action coupling. So it kind of gives you a very different view of what it means to be skillful, right? The traditional view and information processing view is we learn the one correct technique for throwing or something like that, and we get better by repeating it over and over and over. So we develop this kind of program in our head, that like software in our head that we can pull out when we want to execute that movement. Whereas ecological dynamics is more about connecting with your environment, learning to pick up information from your environment and link it to some aspect of your movement you can adjust. And the essential idea that to be skillful involves being variable, right? You don't do the same movement every time. You need to adjust and adapt. So it's more about being adaptable in the environment.
Yeah, so when I went through PT school and we had clinical neuroscience, which was essentially a class where you really went into depth into all of the different reflexes. And then there was half of the class that was allocated to some of the motor learning principles and science. And the interesting thing was, it was supposed to be an overview of all of the different theories of motor learning, and then practical applications, or basically trying to show everybody, hey, here's what these things are, and then here's how one may use some of the concepts or use the theory to influence movement. And what was interesting was it was all through an information processing lens. So when you got to the ecological theory, you ended up with basically this explanation. Well, this theory is all about the environment, and we know that's not true. so I felt we were done a disservice. And then, at that time, I had already been listening to some of your podcasts and those sorts of things. And around that time was when I started reading some of Franz Bosch's work as well. and what was pretty astounding to me is what I was already doing with my baseball players had quite a bit, even though I didn't have necessarily all of the knowledge associated with what ecological dynamics really was. I was using a lot of, I guess, those concepts in my practice, right? So, utilizing a constraints led approach and utilizing these other techniques without the kind of fundamental understanding of what ecological dynamics really was. And so we get into this point where people, including myself, have kind of moved through the system, if you will, and have been trained into believing that this is how these things work. And then something's thrown at you that totally flips everything upside down. And it's tough to deal with as a professional or as a student or whatever it may be.
Yeah, no, some good points there, Max. I think, as I said before, I think we kind of lost. It's so ingrained in us that there's another alternative is kind of not really considered sometimes, or it's just one quick thing at the end of a long discussion. Yeah, and I have the same experience in working with a lot of coaches, and same as you, Max. The ecological dynamics is just putting a theoretical framework on what a lot of good coaches are already doing, right? They've discovered through their own experimentation, their own trying different things, these ideas. One of the fundamental ones, the one Franz Bosch always, emphasizes, the self-organization idea, the idea that you can't impose on an athlete how to move, right? Tell them you need to do this with your elbow. Like Franz says, the body doesn't care what the coach has to say. Right. So using constraints to encourage self-organization, doing things like that. I think a lot of coaches have been doing that for a long time. And this, I think, just is kind of putting a framework and some of the terminology, which I really believe is beneficial because I think it helps you extend it. Even if you're already doing it, understanding why it works exactly and how all the pieces fit together, I think is really useful.
And everybody would act like maybe this is a brand new approach or a brand new theory, because the way that we've been coaching people and probably Western coaching, as well as what you'd see in Soviet Union, old stuff from the Soviet Union, is based on the information processing theory. But then if you look at where a lot of the best soccer players in the world come from, where a lot of the best baseball players in the world come from, and then also look at what a lot of the athletes in United States, in Canada, in Europe have been doing, is there's some play that's unorganized. There's implicit learning that's occurring because they're practicing with their buddies as they grow up and they're playing around. And I think one of the best examples of that is, I'm a big wrestling guy. So if you watch wrestling, like some of the best wrestlers in the world historically, even from these that grew up in these institutions where drilling is a big thing, because in wrestling it's like, take them down, they're going to be your dummy, you use this exact technique and you do it 25, 50 times in a row. But then you see those same guys, they're before practice, after practice, they're rolling around, they're experimenting, they're going 50%. One guy's going 60%, one guy's going 30%, letting the guy do it, but he's still giving them some resistance, and they're kind of going through some strange positions. And you've seen an evolution in that sport, and that now there's so many different techniques that guys are utilizing as well, and they're more successful, a lot of them, than what was ever used in kind of the robotic forms of wrestling in the past.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you could, there's lots of definite examples of great athletes where you dig in. We kind of have this superficial thing where we, that great athletes are because they practice more. Like they do 1 million repetitions. Like Michael Jordan was great because he did 1 million jump shots, the same one over and over. He stayed in the gym after. And I think the view's starting to change when you dig deeper. Now you're seeing like people like Stephen Curry, right? He adds 1 million sources of variability in his practice, right? He's doing a lot of different things to kind of shake things up and trying different things instead of focusing on repeating the one technique. So yeah, I think you do, when you kind of look at the history, you see there's more to the story than the strict drilling and repetition in a lot of great athletes. I think a lot of great athletes I've worked with are definitely not afraid to experiment try things. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely true.
How do we access like probably the people that are like myself or even a lot of the coaches out there who have kind of grown up and been trained into this one model of thinking, whether that's by their coaches, whether that's by what they learned in university or in a book. And now they're at a point where they want to become more effective in their implementation because we're probably, I mean, and you could speak more on this than I could, but like a lot of the people who are the researchers and the professors who are entrenched in the information processing theory, they're not going to really budge too much. Maybe some of them will, but I'm thinking of more the people who are on the ground level that are working with athletes, and that's really why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because you can articulate this so much better than I can, because we still see so much of that, especially in my sport of baseball, is where I notice the most of it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point, Max, and I think it's fair, definitely fair when you can't expect people to completely abandon everything they've been doing and not want to keep some of the old things. And I kind of there's a bunch of set of things I kind of recommend, like if you're interested in these ideas and you want to change. Is the first one is being purposeful in your practice. Like a lot of what I do as a consultant is just ask why. Why are you doing that drill? What about that athlete's performance in the last game or competition is this meant to address? Are you just doing it because you always do that drill, or I did that one? Like, let's think about that more. Making practice more game-like, right? Can we turn this into a game, right? Can we take the example I always like is soccer, dribbling around cones. Let's play tag instead. Like you can, I say especially if you're coaching kids, you can tell when you got this right. You'll hear the difference. You'll go from the silence of people standing in line running technical drills to kids yelling and screaming. And then the biggest one, baseball that I've kind of I work in baseball as well, and the adding variability to practice. The old hitting off the pitching coach that's throwing the same speed, or a batting machine that's throwing the same speed. Let's change things up a little bit. There's so many benefits to adding variability. It allows you to be adaptable, and I think that's the easiest win that a lot of coaches can do. So think about being adaptable, not being perfect in practice, I think is a way to think about it.
And basically what we're saying here is don't just practice one thing and just practice one thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Add some other elements into it. Like I listened to one of your podcasts where you did talk about Steph Curry, and he was basically running sprints to fatigue, then shooting, which is going to allow him to be more adaptable to his environment when he gets into that game and he's fatigued. But we have so many ways in which we can start to do that, and you're still practicing your technique. And I think that's what a lot of the coaches have to understand is like you're still practicing your technique, but you're doing so under varying conditions and circumstances, which is what you're going to encounter when you get into the game.
Yeah, and that's kind of the message. It's a very different message, kind of tough for people to accept, but is that like technique is linked to the environment. Like it's functional. Like we have this very old view of skill. Like for example, the idea you need to be able to swing before you can hit in baseball. I need to put a ball on a tee and teach you the fundamentals of the movement of swinging before you can go and hit a ball. The alternate ecological dynamics, we really don't believe in this idea of the fundamentals, like that you have to decompose and break a thing apart, then put it back in. Because the thing is all about, right? You can't hit a ball without being able to pick up the information about the ball flight, and how you swing depends on how you pick up information. Those are linked together. So that's a kind of a fundamental change, that the technique, the actual basic movement pattern of coordination will emerge. The word we use is emerge in the actual context of the game. It doesn't need to be pulled apart and taught first before you can put it in the game. That kind of idea is kind of, we're moving away from, definitely.
Yeah, because you eliminate a lot of the sensory input. You eliminate a lot of the contextual factors that are going to actually that are going to actually dictate in a lot of ways how you move.
Yeah. Yeah. And like it's simple. And the other thing we do in those decomposed technical drills is we take away all the decision making from the athlete. Like you do a hitting drill where you have to swing every time, whereas being a skillful hitter is about deciding when to swing and when not to, right? In almost every sport, we lament that we don't have more creativity, better decision making, yet we don't hardly have any of that in practice. And we're surprised that it's not there when we get to the game. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
So this is something that, I struggle with all the time. If you've grown up or you have expected a certain thing, when I go to practice, my job is when I go to practice, I want to leave practice and my skill is visibly better than when I arrived at practice. And a lot of times that's not to our benefit. So I get this all the time because I get people coming in, they want to improve their throwing technique. They come in, their throw looks a certain way. They want to leave, and they want it to look better right away when they leave, which doesn't always necessarily mean that their throw is going to actually be better just because it changed for that period of time. So you get that aspect of it where I need these changes and I need these alterations in how I move or how it looks that I move, this aesthetic component, and I need that now. I think you get that a lot with hitting instruction, but then you also get the effect of if I'm throwing at a full distance or if I'm throwing to a target and we're changing things or we're utilizing different constraints and that individual is not accurate, all of a sudden that's perceived as this isn't working. He can't throw a strike doing this. When in fact, whoa, there's a lot more going on here.
Yeah, there's a lot of good points there, Max. Definitely in motor learning, we kind of make this dichotomy between performance and learning, right? Performing is looking good in practice, right? And, if I gave you throwing to a catcher that had a mitt twice as big, right? You would feel really good. I'm hitting my target in practice. I'm looking really good, or everything was really predictable for a hitter. I'm not varying the speed much. I'm not varying the pitch type much. I look really good. I feel like I'm doing well in practice, but that's performing. Learning, right? Learning, we need to do a couple things. We need to challenge you. And learning, we learn from mistakes, right? We need to fail to learn. So you're right. Some things that make us struggle and, not do well in an individual practice session are the best things for getting better in the future, which is what we're trying to do. So, yeah, I think, coaches have to set the kind of expectation of we move away from, we do, in a lot of team sports, we have this idea that everything should look perfect and organized and things. I go through even major league camps. I see some fielding drills where they're teaching a catcher how to field bunts. And every single time they know, before the play starts, they know where the bunt's going to go and what base to throw to. Right? That's not how baseball works. That makes it look really good in practice, like they're really accomplished. But what we're moving to is actually looking bad and challenging is going to make you better in the game later on. When you get a bunt that spins out of control, there's two men on base, right? You have to adapt. So, yeah, I think we really need to change. The coach needs to set the expectation that, it doesn't have to be this way for every activity, but this activity is really going to challenge you. You're going to fail some of the time. That's exactly what I expect. I'm not expecting you to be perfect every time, and the players kind of have to embrace that.
Yeah, and I'll go as far as to say, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Rob, but I'll go as far as to say that just because you're doing some of those drills where the catcher knows exactly where it's going doesn't mean that's a bad thing, or doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that maybe that's not the most optimal thing to train the catcher to get better at fielding and throwing, fielding the bunt and throwing it down to the base. Maybe I can still continue to use some of that, but I have to start to add some stuff that is variable in nature, or, hey, it's unpredictable. He doesn't know where this bunt's going to go, or it's an actual bunt, and then he's got to field it while there's a hitter in the box or whatever it may be. Because, I'm not ready to completely throw a lot of that stuff out, and I know coaches aren't either, and I don't believe that's what you're saying.
No, definitely. I think, a really important idea is kind of periodizing skill training like we do physical training. The idea that there's times where we really want to push you and challenge you and get you to learn something different and be adaptable. Then there's other times, maybe closer to the game, we just want to make you feel confident. And so maybe less variability, more predictability we're not really our goal. That's kind of going back to that point I made about being purposeful. What is the goal of this drill? Is it to get the catcher to learn to field bunts from all different angles and be really adaptable? Or is it just to make them feel confident about the next game, right? So having a goal of the particular session. So, yeah, I think so. I think there's definitely room for all those kind of things.
Absolutely. And then where do we make room for direct instruction in an ecological theory? Because that's really the foremost thing, or the number one tool in the toolbox of the information processing theory is, hey, we got to tell them what they need to do and how to do it so that they can do it properly. But we're not abandoning that if we start to work in a way that's more contextual to the environment and to the task and the individual. We're just saying, hey, we have to alter the reason behind why we do it and then how we do it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. You nailed it right on the head there, Max. Yeah, this is a common misconception of this approach, that I'm just designing practice, then I stand back and don't do anything. Absolutely, as a coach, if you see something, the athlete doing something that might lead to injury, or you still have to use your expertise as a coach. That's not going to work, right? So you can step in with some instruction. You want to do it a lot less, right? And you want to have it a good reason. You don't want to step in because that's not the typical way people swing. Maybe it works for that person. And you also want to try to avoid, try to use, one of the things, in terms of cues, focus on more external. Don't try to focus too much on the body. Try driving the ball the other way, or adding another constraint, right? If the person's pulling off the ball, you can put something on the ground that they tell them not to step over it, right? So there's different ways. You still want to kind of step in and guide. So the way I like to think of it is a guide, not an instructor, right? So I'm not going to tell you the answer, but I am going to step in and kind of push you and lead you. Try that path, is the way that I like to think about it.
How did you kind of start to migrate into this approach? Because I know that you've done a lot of work in the past, and if you went back and probably listened to some of your initial stuff that you put online, you have a very different perspective on things than probably when you first started your podcast or those sorts of things.
Yeah, for sure. There's a couple. One, I do try to cover the other, the information processing approach, even though it's kind of not my thing. But I definitely have changed over there. What really happened? So I researched a lot of information processing ideas of automaticity, repetition. And then when I really went to try to apply it, I started working with major league teams and other sports as well. I really found I didn't know what to do. The kind of direct, explicit instruction wasn't working. I didn't really have a good understanding of how, the actual act of hitting and swinging a bat was coming about. And so once I kind of wanted to apply it more directly and help hitters, I found that the ecological approach, where we actually go about explaining how the movement is achieved, right, it was much more valuable to me. And then I just, the ideas of self-organization and things, once you kind of get into things, just made a lot more sense to me when I was trying to do it. Go to look at the whole picture.
Yeah, and this isn't, when we talk about self-organization, I mean, we're not just talking about random self-organization. We're talking about as the coach, in a way, sitting up here as the master puppeteer in sort of a way, and putting obstacles or putting different things into the environment or into the task to try to direct that self-organization in a certain direction.
Yeah, for sure. The kind of the phrase we should always use when we talk about self-organization with respect to constraints, right? So we organize our behavior relative to the constraints imposed on us, right? are my own constraints, my height, my flexibility, the environment, whether it's windy, what the task is. And you're perfectly right. The way the coach can step in is adding constraints, changing them to kind of push you and change the way you're self-organizing, right? Because they're right. That another common thing I hear is, well, won't people self-organize into bad movement solutions? Yes, for sure. But that's why as a coach, you have to change the constraints and move them away from those or kind of help to guide them to a better solution.
Yeah, I like that. And it's like, when can they self-organize into a bad solution or a less optimal solution? Maybe due to constraints, and I always look at like physical constraints first. As a physical therapist, I'm looking at, okay, do they have hamstring flexibility? Do they have lat flexibility? What's their hip internal rotation? And so maybe based on those constraints, that's going to lead them to pathway of least resistance into a less efficient movement. But we also have to consider, the big one that, and I like this terminology, is looking for energy in the wrong place. Just you have a finite number of solutions out there. It seems infinite. It's a lot of solutions, and I'm going to choose one of them. That doesn't mean I chose the best option.
For sure. And you were, as human beings, we're brutally efficient learners, right? We'll latch on to whatever works given the situation you put me in. Often with not, we don't have an eye towards being in, another set of conditions or more demanding conditions. Just what works now, and we're also very not particularly good at taking into account long-term injury possibilities and stuff. We're just, we'll latch on to, So for sure, I think, and I think that's an important point you raise about. I like to think about kind of the link between strength and conditioning, physical therapy, and skill training. That we need a better link between them, right? When you increase my flexibility or my ability to rotate, you suddenly have just given me more possible solutions. Doesn't mean I'm going to take them, but if we link those together, instead of trying to instruct you into a solution with traditional instructions that I can't do, work on the actual giving me more capacity in my body. So yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, and I like what you brought up there, which was just because you've chosen a pattern that's stable or allows you to be somewhat successful where you're at, doesn't mean that strategy is always going to work. So you could throw a certain way and, hey, I'm not having any elbow pain, but that doesn't mean I'm always going to not have elbow pain just because I didn't right now. Long term, that strategy may lead to wear and tear and strain on my ulnar collateral ligament based on the way in which I moved, and that's just the solution that I chose.
Yeah, for sure. The example I sometimes like to give is, early separation in pitcher. When you separate your body from your arm from your body really early. I think your phrasing is exactly right. People are trying to generate energy from the whip in their arm instead of letting the kinetic chain stay together. And that, when you're young and healthy and you don't have many throw pitches on your odometer, right, that can work really well. But you probably, in the long term, that's probably not going to be the best solution, and there's lots of examples like that. You're right. We're very efficient at getting something that works for the constraints imposed upon us. And that's why, hitting off the same setting on a pitching machine, you'll develop a skill that works for that. Then you get to a pitcher that's varying speeds and locations, and what do? Right? You have to learn a new one. So yeah, that's a really important point.
What are your thoughts on kind of the idea of the universal attractors? Because you're trying to build stability in the movement where my movement is resilient to various environmental factors or uncontrollables. Like I like to talk to my athletes, there's uncontrollables out there, and the better that you are at this skill, or the more stable you are, the better you're going to be able to tolerate those and adapt when you get into the competition or into the game. Kind of how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I think, could talk about it in terms of attractors. I like to talk about, I think, all skillful movements have both invariant properties that have to be there, for all executions and all movement, and variant properties, things that can change from execution. And right, if we didn't have invariant things, then you wouldn't be able to classify things as throwing, hitting, right? So I think, yeah, there's some key things that you need to stabilize. I think the one I just kind of talked about, transfer of force, in a kinetic chain. If you want maximal performance, you have to have that, right? I think. And I think there's a few other key attractors. You stabilize around those, make sure they're there, use constraints to get those as a coach, and then let everything else vary, right? Because you don't have to have the exact same stride length so it seems like there's these attractors, but there's some of the kinematics around those you can let vary.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you can throw a lot of different, like if you throw slow, if you throw 40 miles an hour, you can do basically any combination of things, and the ball can come out 40 miles an hour, because it's not difficult to throw 40 miles an hour. But when you throw fast, certain things are going to happen that are the same, not just for me, but across some individuals as well. And then there's certain things that are going to vary. So you're not creating the same throw, but you have to there has to be some similarities between this guy who throws 95, this guy who throws 95, and you, if you want to throw 95. Would you say that's correct?
For sure. Yeah, I think this is a point Franz Bosch makes really well. As we push the constraints up and up, the amount of solutions you have available goes down and down, right? There's only so many ways you can make a baseball go 100 miles an hour, right? You can't throw underhand, you can't, sidearms, probably not, so it's narrowing the solution. So yes, there's certain things that definitely have to be there. The kind of the attractors Franz talks about, I think are a good way to think about that.
Yeah, so the attractors that he talks about, now would you say that's the same as or synonymous with variance and then invariance for fluctuators versus attractors? Would you say that's the same, or how would you define those things?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of some fundamental, principles about like co-contraction. Those are kind of the things that are attractors. But then we look at pitching research, like your exact amount of the idea we want to move away from is that you have to have a perfectly repeatable delivery, like everything about the amount of rotation, the maximum elbow flexion, the wrist angle. The traditional idea is those should be all the same or as much as possible from throw to throw. If we look closer, we see those things need to vary, right, to be able to adjust for like fatigue. We were talking about basketball. You let those things work together and vary from execution to execution. Yeah, that's actually a large part of being skillful. So we need these fundamental things, these attractors, but around that, how we achieve that, the actual kinematics, what our knee flexion is and all those things need to vary. And that's kind of the way I think of it.
So it doesn't mean being inconsistent. It basically means I'm controlling consistent outcomes. So I'm still hitting the same... and you need some things to be consistent. Like my release point, if I'm going to throw it to that same spot, I want my release point to be consistent. But how I get to that release point can in fact vary, and probably should vary if I'm going to avoid quote unquote overuse injuries or those sorts of things. And it really has to, because the ground changes. I push off the mound, and now there's a little bit more of a hole here, or a divot here.
Exactly. Yeah. That's kind of one of the kind of the idea. Not only is repetition not the way to being skillful, it's actually impossible, right? If I apply the exact same forces in my body, it's not going to lead to the same outcome. Because as you said, there's little changes going on both internally from fatigue and muscle injury and other things, and the environment as well as changing around me. So I need to be able to adapt. The phrase that we like to use in ecological dynamics comes from a Russian, Nikolai Bernstein: repetition without repetition. I repeat hitting my target as a pitcher, but not by repeating the movement the same way every time. I need to vary the movement slightly differently every time to achieve the same goal of hitting my target.
So with this in mind, like, do you think there's times that the way in which we operate has to be based on an information processing approach, or I don't even know how I would articulate that, but I'm thinking of high intensity skills versus low intensity skills, or even any at a low intensity, anything that requires a lot more thought. And that's not to straw man and say that thinking and decision making isn't a part of the ecological approach, but in my mind, I'm thinking about slow movements that are well planned out. I'm going to do this, and I know it's not strictly an information processing theory, but there's something else going on as opposed to what happens at a higher intensity, or in these kind of reactive type of skills.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I would say I don't believe that there's any need for the information processing view. The fundamental idea of direct perception is there's always information from the environment that can guide your movements, whether it's visual information, proprioceptive, right? I don't think that changes when you slow down a movement. Probably what changes is you have more time to kind of process the feedback and attend to the movement, so you kind of have more awareness of what's going on. But I don't believe that's any differently of what you're actually controlling the movement itself. I still think you can explain it the same way.
How do you kind of move over into like the cognitive domain? Because like we're talking about movement skills, but just in my mind, I'm also thinking about like mathematics or something. Like the way we and I don't know if this is even true, but the way I've thought about it is like the way I operate in movement from a neurological standpoint can't be drastically different than the way I would operate in thinking or solving a mathematics problem, or can it?
Yeah, that's I think there's a couple of things. I think the idea of doing a math problem, you have you're not really temporally constrained. You're not actually controlling the movements of your limbs. You're just coming up with you're using abstract symbols, math equations to solve an abstract problem. So I think it's fundamentally different than actually moving your body in a skillful manner. But at the same time, I think we all recognize, as a teacher, I recognize that the way that we teach is very much an information processing view. Here, I'm going to tell you all the stuff about math. You regurgitate it to me on a test. Done, grade. Where, I think most of us in education realize that's an efficient way to learn, and that's the way to teach, and that's a way that we've always done it. But I don't think I think most of us would agree it's not the best way if we actually wanted you to learn something about math, we get you to apply it, right? Try building something, build something that flies, learn about dynamics, right? I think, but that takes more time. That's another problem with this challenge with the ecological approach. It takes more time, right? It takes more. You have to let people find their way and figure things out. It's much easier just to tell someone that shows up the first day, here's how you swing. Mm-hmm. It looks like they got some proficiency, you done your job, check, leave. But we're kind of playing more the long game. So I think there's, there are people that do like ecological approach to higher level functions like math and processing, but which probably I don't think too much about, to be honest, but there are people that conceptualize it that way as well.
Yeah, I'd have to do some more research into that, because that is interesting. And like I could tell you, I mean, I remember probably 50th of what I've learned regarding math over the years, and that's probably based on the approach and in the way in which it was taught, but also my practical application, like you're saying here, and like you'll remember things that you're practically applying because you have to. You learn that's a skill that you need. But that's and that's kind of my thought is like with human movement at a slower intensity. I have thought about that as more of something that it is in my mind something that may require more of the more actual processing of the environment. And I don't know if I'm looking at that wrong, but I think once you get into like I would look at like something like curling, like fundamentally different than something like throwing a baseball based on just the intensity of the skill. Where do you think I'm like going wrong, or where do you think I'm off here? Because I'm thinking of the guy sliding the thing really slowly down the line, and certainly he can make online corrections, but you know there has to be some sort of fundamental difference, and you know that's why I've thought like, you know, we operate on certain things now, but what about in like 50 years? Somebody might come out with something a little more comprehensive.
For me, you know, I'm stubborn. You know, in the ecological side, one of the things we do is we be stubborn about it. We're always looking to try to explain it from the information in the environment. If I appeal to some you could in curling, I could say I developed some internal mental model of how the projectile motion of a curling stone, right, to predict based on the angle. To me, that doesn't really solve anything. It just says I have a thing in my head that helps skill, right? Whereas in the ecological approach, we would say through practice and learn. If you took a baseball pitcher, and they'd learn the dynamics of a curling stone. They'd learn the feel, the proprioceptive information. They'd learn picking up information from the ice, the target. So they learn by calibrating their movement of throwing a stone by linking it to information from the environment. They don't need to develop any complex model of the physics of curling. That's kind of the information processing approach, is that there's not enough information in the environment. I need to enhance it. So I need to somehow develop a predictive model of physics of ice and curling stone, and which seems overly complex to me anyway. But that's kind of the way I think about it. I think there's always, if you look hard enough, there's always information in the environment that I can pick up that can guide the action without the need for any additional processing. That's a fundamental Gibson's idea of direct perception that kind of we stick to doggedly and stubbornly sometimes.
So I don't know if the way to test it would be to take those curlers and then, let's say, put them on, instead of real ice, we put them on fake ice, and then we say, all right, like how long does it take them to adapt to that environment? Because if it is like you're saying, and you know, they should be able to adapt, I would say, rather quickly. Like, I'm seeing my results, and I'm just gonna change what I'm doing a little bit to alter my results, or I'm gonna, you know, online information of what I feel as I'm moving forward before I release the whatever that thing is called. What are your thoughts? How would you like put forward a test? Because like that's probably what we're gonna need, you know, in the future. And you know, I'm not too stuck on any of that. I guess I'm pretty malleable in that respect. But I think a lot of people are stuck on, you know, one side of the.
Yeah, it's hard for me. You know, it's hard to come out with an experiment like that contrasts. Right. In the ecological approach, the way that I think about it is, if I can find an information source that it can explain what you're doing, like a good example is catching a fly ball in baseball, right? There's been a lot of work showing the way people actually catch a fly ball is they couple their running to the information from the ball, the rate at which is accelerating across your eye, right? And there's lots of evidence showing that's what they do. That's why fielders don't just run to a location, stand there, and wait for the ball to be there. That's why center fielders have most trouble with balls hit directly at them. The information. So if I can find an information source and shows it, explains the behavior, then the ecological approach is one, right? Because then I don't need to try to say they have a model of the projectile motion physics in their head, right? Because I've explained the whole thing by information which I have access to. Anytime I refer to an internal model or processing, I can't see that. It's a black box in your head, right? So if I can explain it from the environment, to me, I can stop there because I don't need to try to contrast and show the two are different, because I've explained it in a visible, simplified, simpler way. So for me, it's more about instead of designing experiments that compare and contrast, indirect and direct, it's about doing more experiments that try to figure out what information people are using.
Yeah,
that's what I do.
That's fair enough. I mean, you can tell I
Yeah.
have a little bit of cognitive dissonance here.
Oh no, it's very common. This, it's very. I get a lot of the similar comments. So yes, for sure, it makes total sense.
Yeah. So if we were to kind of branch this into a little bit, I guess, a slightly different domain, which is top-down versus bottom-up processing or controls of movement, if you will. How do we make sense of that in terms of like high intensity movement, just from a general perspective? And I guess for the listeners, like what are we talking about when we talk about like top down versus bottom up controls of movement?
Yeah, so the top down idea is, the basic idea that we control, it's all about our brain, right? Skills all in our brain. I have a motor program, this kind of software in my brain for how to pitch, right? So my brain, I have a thing that's going to, when I say I want to pitch now, it's going to say, okay, elbow do this, wrist do that, shoulder do that. So it's specifying all the parameters of my body in the movement. The brain is specifying this. That's top down. Top means brain to body, right? So your body is just kind of this unintelligent subservient of your brain, right? Versus bottom up is where the argument that control actually lies within the body itself. The brain's kind of specifying intentions, picking up the information, coupling to the information, but how the actual movement is actually done is sorted out at the lower levels, at the bottom. The example we always give in ecological dynamics is a flock of birds, right? A flock of birds organizes and flies and goes all over without hitting each other. There's no boss bird in a flock of birds, right? There's no one telling each bird what to do. All they're doing is, okay, my neighbor's coming at me, I'll move away. And when they all do that and work together, it gets this overall pattern of organization. And that's kind of what people think is happening in the body, right? We're getting at the lower levels. It's kind of hard. I know this is kind of hard to conceptualize, but the organization is happening at the lower levels as well. It's not all about information stored in your brain.
Yeah, I like to think of it like you have your like headquarters, like your military headquarters, but then you have all these command outposts, and the command outposts cannot always have to call the headquarters before they respond because they don't always have time. And that's how I've conceptualized it or analogized it to people. But and I don't know if that's a perfect representation, but it kind of works in a way. It's like you have your big headquarters here, which is going to give us the general like idea of, hey, here's what needs to happen, and then you've got these command outposts that are really going to figure out how to make it happen.
Yeah, that's I think that's a great analogy. In my book, I use a business, which is very similar.
Yep.
Like the traditional view, a good CEO delegates and lets people do their own thing, right? It doesn't they don't tell everyone in the mailroom you need to do this and that next, right? They let people organize themselves a little bit. So yeah, I think that's a good analogy.
Yeah, leadership happens at the top, practical application happens throughout. Something to that effect. So with that in mind, we still see a lot of like I still see a lot of tweets and things like that, like the CNS is king, or it's all about the central nervous system. It's like, okay, but there's a lot more to it, especially when it comes to, if you're talking about precision in throwing or accuracy in throwing, as one example. There's many other factors.
Yeah, I think in general we kind of don't give our body enough credit. Like we're so kind of almost fetishized with the brain that's where all the intelligence is. And I think our body is just an incredible machine that, has so much intelligence of its own to be able to flexibly, adapt and adjust and be variable. I think we just don't take that for granted, I think, in the way we think about things. I think, we think about everything has to be top down from our brain when there's so much else going on, for sure.
Yeah. if I was gonna say, hey, where I need to start learning about this, because you have a lot of materials out there, and like you're going into depth a lot of times, way beyond what we've even talked about here. Where should people start? I mean, you have a great book that's out too, so you definitely want to plug that. But where should people start learning about it if they're basically where I was, a few years back, where it was like a new thing for me?
Yeah, no, good question, Max. And this, not sounding like a plug, but the exact reason I wrote the book, which is called How We Learn to Move on Amazon, there's my plug, was that I get this question a lot. And I had a hard time giving people a good answer of, there's a lot of great books out there, and there's some more coming like specific to people's sports. But there's a lot of terminology in this. You probably, like today, we hit a lot of them already, and it's fairly high level. So I tried to write the book to be, here's the basic logic of the ecological approach, the idea of variability, repetition without repetition, self-organization, attractors. And I tried to put it all link it all together. And that was my goal in writing the book, to give people a starting point. And so far, it's pretty good feedback that I achieved that. So that would be where I would start, and then go from there. At the end of the book, I created these, I called them exploration guides, so where you can go to next in some of my resources and other people's. But yeah, if you jump into the podcast, like at the latest episodes, it's very deep in the weeds, right? You're going to have trouble. So I get that a lot. So yeah, that's really, the book it was meant to be for me, the starting point for people.
Okay. Yeah, so the book, start with the book, and like I said, there's a lot of great stuff. I truly believe this. I truly believe that if you read your book, if you read both of Franz Bosch's 2 most recent books, if you listen to all your episodes of the podcast, I mean, I'm hard pressed to say that you don't have you haven't accrued as much knowledge as equivalent to a master's degree in the topic. I really do believe that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I would read definitely Franz books. There's books, The Dynamics of Skill Acquisition, and the ones by Chris Button and Keith Davids and colleagues are really good as well. So yeah, there's a lot of good resources out there. It's just, kind of have fun with it. And, and there's some sports specific ones, as I mentioned. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can get this information. It's available out there now for sure. It's great to have it. Getting it from the original sources of the papers, the journal articles, that can be pretty tough too, because it's some pretty very high level stuff. And when we write journal articles, we really write them for our colleagues, not people outside the area. So yeah, there's a lot of great resources now for getting into this stuff.
Yeah, that's why I like your materials. Especially because, like, I read a paper yesterday on complexity theory. Basically, it got sent to me I just recently started using Google Scholar for alerts on papers, and it got sent to me because it was about complexity, but it was also about pitching. So, and I was like reading it. I'm like a quarter of the way through. And I'm like, I don't even know what's going on here anymore. There's so many symbols, and it was so complex. I'm like, holy cow, this is way beyond. I don't even know what I'm going to be able to get out of this thing.
I have the same thing.
Articles or books like yours, and then your podcast does a great job of breaking down a lot of complex things, which will give you the base. If you take all this information, you could go in and start to peruse the literature and gain a lot out of it after going through what you've put out there for free, which is why I love it, because I love anything where people have access to material.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it, Max. Yeah, I should point out, these are not just my ideas of how to be skillful. I'm building off a lot of people's work and just disseminating it and trying to make it more understandable. Turvey and Carl Newell and Gibson and Bernstein, they're the ones that have all the big ideas. I just try to make it more digestible for people. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you once again for coming on the podcast. The name of Rob's podcast is the Action Perception Podcast. He's got a lot of that stuff on YouTube if you're on YouTube, but also all the podcasting platforms, and Rob is fairly active, I would say, on Twitter as well. Where's the best place for people to reach out to you or send you a question that you may get a chance, if possible, to answer on your podcast or at some other time?
So the best single place to go, I have a website, perceptionaction.com, that has all the podcasts, my book, all my social media. It has some resources too. I talk about the ecological approach to preventing injury and things like that. So I would suggest going there. I think you can, anything you want to do there, you can find there.
Awesome. One last very quick question. I'm curious. Since you started all of this work on the internet and have become much more popular, especially in this niche area, have you noticed that you have a lot more people trying to sign up for your classes?
At ASU, it not somewhat. I'm kind of hidden away in a weird way. In my program's not really sports focused at all. I'm really the only, but I have been teaching for a long time. I've been teaching a course called Human Factors in Sports, which is pretty popular. Wanted it because there's not a ton of them, but no, not yet. Really, a lot more like coaches and teams reaching out to me. But yeah, it has. One day I hope to put like a course plan online.
Yeah, that'd be awesome
for people. But that's on my big to-do list of other things.
Okay.
So, right. But yeah, no, not yet. Good question, though.
In the name of Overhead Athletics, I'm Max, and we're signing off.